Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, October 22nd, 2009. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, a trip back in time to visit a bit of German brewing history with homebrewer Kai Troester. Kai has been reading brewing texts from the 19th century, and he shares some of what he's learned with us today. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter, my username, Basic Brewing, all one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. And you can find our shows on our Facebook page on Facebook, which is at facebook.com/basicbrewing. And I send out updates to fans of the show through that page whenever new episodes are posted and such. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you this show, and we appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site, too. And we appreciate the relationship with both of those entities. Good stuff. Just a quick note to say that our Basic Brewing video episode featuring Alex Gunum of Upright Brewing Company is out there now. You can, if you take a look at that, you'll get to see the cool setup that Alex has in his basement brewery to brew up interesting beers for the Portland area. And we had a lot of fun at Upright, and I hope that you'll have fun watching the episode. And if you're in the Portland area, look for Alex's beers. They are something to look out for, definitely. Let's get right to the meat of the matter, since Kai and I talked for a good amount of time this week. In the past, I've said a couple of times on this program that you can't know how far you've come unless you know where you've been. And that's one reason that I found Kai's research to be interesting. Kai is essentially giving us a peek into what brewing technology was like in 1860s Germany. Well, Kai Troester, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Well, thanks for having me back.
I always get good comments when you come on.
Thanks.
Either people think you know what you're talking about, or it just sounds like you know what you're talking about.
Oh, yes, it must be the accent. So if you can't really hear what I'm saying, then probably it must be right.
Well, you speak with authority, so and you have the authentic accent, so that lends credibility, I guess. But you've been putting your language talents to work in translating some historic German brewing texts, right?
Yes, that was beginning of this year. I was always searching around in Google, and I came across old German brewing books that were scanned and then put on Google Books, and because they don't have, or because their copyright expired, they are completely available for free. And I was reading through some of them, and I was surprised how detailed of a description of the brewing process was there.
And are these books that were textbooks for training of brewers?
No, those books were actually more targeted at the, I would say, curious and affluent population. One of these books is called a conversation encyclopedia, and I assumed that it was an encyclopedia that contained information for people to just talk about. If they would at some cocktail party, some subject would come up, then people could go back at home to that encyclopedia and read up on it, and then show off their knowledge at the next time they met each other.
So before television, people actually had to talk to each other.
Yes, I guess so. And with respect to textbooks for brewing itself, I don't think that really existed for when it comes to the training of the brewer. Back during those days, brewers were very secretive, and I will talk to during this interview as well. And they didn't really want anybody else to know what they know. because it was a trial and error process to get a good beer. And once you had it, you don't want to give up that knowledge to a competitor.
So in a sense, they sort of barely knew what they were doing, even though that this process had been done for generations and generations. They knew how to do it, but they didn't necessarily know why to do it, right?
Yes, that throughout this book, this text that I translated here, you get the idea that they are on the right track, that they figured out what is good, what's not good for beer, and they came up with some theory that, in hindsight, that doesn't really work all the time, but it worked enough for them to make themselves believe, okay, this is how it works, and this is why I do it this way.
So if you did something and you got good beer, you did that same thing again.
You kept doing it, and you made sure that you kept doing it that way, and you told your offsprings who would then take over the brewery that they have to do it this way.
And you didn't tell your competitors.
Yes.
Now, what else was going on around the world in the beer world at about this time? What time frame are we looking at?
So the book that where I got most of that from was called Layman Chemistry, and it was published in 1860. And I also got some of the information and the pictures. Well, obviously for the pictures you will have to go to my webpage at brauerkaiser.com to see them, and some of those pictures are from this conversation encyclopedia, which was published at the end of the 19th century. And in addition to that, because I'm talking about pictures and diagrams, I also included a number of pictures I took in German brewing museums when I was there last year. So that kind of helped us. I translated that text after I went to Germany and saw some of the stuff in those brewing museums and said, oh yeah, this is actually what he's talking about here. I saw in a museum, and that was interesting as well.
Now, what else was going on historically around that time? I mean, around the middle of the 1800s was a pretty important time for the brewing sciences. Yeah,
the three milestones that I noted here was that in 1842, Joseph Groll brewed the first Pilsner at the Burger Brauerei in Pilsen. And then in 1860, Louis Pasteur showed that yeast is a living thing and the cause of fermentation. Up to that point, there was a camp that believed that yeast is a living thing and is the reason for fermentation, and there was another camp saying that fermentation is a purely chemical process that is brought on by air. And in 1874, Carl von Linde completed the first ice machine at the Spaten Brewery in Munich, which is an important milestone for the brewing of bottom fermented beers because they required cooling.
Right, and that kind of freed the brewer up to brew year round after that.
Yes, exactly.
So it's interesting, and we'll get into talking about how they treated yeast, but yeast was an important part of the process, yet they didn't, I guess, they didn't understand the impact that yeast had on the entire, what they called a chemical process at that point.
Right. Well, at that point, they knew the stuff that collected at the bottom of the fermenter, that was the cause of fermentation. And some actually called it yeast, and others called it ferment. And basically the thing that ferments stuff. And they knew that they had to take that and add that to a batch of wort to start that fermentation.
So they knew that it was an important part. They just didn't know why.
Right.
Again, they knew the how,
Right.
but they didn't know the why.
Well, they kind of had the idea. I mean, this is around 1860. That's just Louis Pasteur. While he's cited with actually discovering yeast, he only kind of showed a conclusive experiment that quieted all the other voices that were saying that fermentation is a chemical process brought on by the oxygen in the air. So up to that, so I guess in the middle of the 1800s and probably in the early 1800s, that's where they figured out what yeast is and how it works. And part of that book, which I didn't translate, actually contains a chapter about just fermentation chemistry. And there the author talks about experiments where, for example, if you divide a fermenting liquid and a non-fermenting liquid with a membrane, that would not cause the non-fermenting part to ferment. So they kind of had an idea. They kind of are playing around with how can you get something to ferment and how can you make it stop fermenting. So they knew that if you boil something, you will kill it. The group that said, oh, it's the oxygen, they said, well, if you boil things, then you drive out the oxygen. So that's how you stop the fermentation. So that's. In hindsight, this is a very interesting thing to read, because you always, like with every sentence, you go, well, little did they know.
Yeah, it's definitely recognizable, and there are some sentences in there that we can still identify with today. And as we go along the process, I'm going to try to pick out some of those sentences to quote that I found interesting and entertaining. But back then, if you had a brewery, you brought in raw barley seed, yes, essentially, and out the other end came beer. You controlled the entire process.
Exactly. So different than what is done today, where malting has become a specialized industry, actually separate from the brewing industry almost. The malting process was part of the brewery, and the head brewer was also the head maltster. So they would take the barley and they would start the malting process, which like today consisted of steeping it, germinating it, drying, and then kilning it. And the steeping was done in large vessels or vats. They might be made of wood or stone, and they serve to increase the moisture content of the grain. And once the grain picked up enough moisture, they were brought onto the what's called Malztenne, or the floor, where they would then germinate, would left to germinate. And the control of the germination was where a lot of the skill of the maltster was important, because he had to control the temperature of that grain and the moisture content of that grain by making making piles. And if the temperature got too high inside the pile, he would have to spread it out a little more to regulate that temperature. And if it gets too low, he had to pile it back up to then get it all evenly malted and germinated.
Now, what was their perception of the process that was happening inside those grains during the malting system?
Well, they actually thought that the malting itself creates the sugar. Well, the text that I read, he contradicts himself a little. I mean, he also, during the mashing process, he talks about the enzymes converting the starch, but he also talks in the malting section that the purpose of malting is to convert the starch in the malt to sugar. And we know today that that is not the case. I mean, malting is should only take care of the destruction or the degradation of cell walls with the cytolysis, and to create the enzymes that are then needed to convert the sugar.
And they understood that malting the grain longer and sort of what we know today as
modification.
Giving the grain a higher modification level actually changes the character of the beer.
Right. They found out that if the malt is germinated longer, that the resulting beer would be clearer, more alcoholic, but would have less mouthfeel to it. Whereas if it was germinated shorter, then the beer would be hazier and more robust. And we today know that, yes, that is basically how you control the modification of the malt.
And he talked a couple of times about the dextrins being the nutritious part of the beer. The unfermentable sugars being the I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the nutrition part of the beer. The alcohol provided the spirit. The carbonation provided the flavor, and then the hops were the spice.
Yes.
I thought that was an interesting way to look at it.
Yes, back then the style of writing was much more. I don't know how to really call it, but it was much more verbose. He liked also to drift off often, and to explain something, the author would pull from some other unrelated field, some story.
And talking about malting, one of the quotes I enjoyed was, "And now that we have the thermometer, it has become child's play compared to past times where the bare hand was used to measure the temperature." So they're all high tech now that they've got the thermometer.
Yeah. Basically, that thermometer that helped brewing consistency in brewing a lot.
Oh man, I can't. You can't imagine. I mean,
But I figure if you are a maltster at the time, and that's what you do day in, day out, after a while you figure out, how warm the grain should feel if it's just right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's your job. That's what you do like 6 days a week back then, probably.
And then when it came time to dry the grain or to kiln the grain, the technology was a bit different then.
Right.
And probably gave a different character to the beer.
It did, and the technology actually could vary widely. To dry the kiln, one way of drying the grain was also to put it onto an attic, and it's what was called the wilting attic. And there it would just dry in the air, and the resulting malt would be called air malt. And that malt was very light in color. It was very strong. It was enzymatically very strong because it didn't receive any heat treatment that it would kill the enzymes. But that malt would not have that characteristic malt flavor. So they also had what we know as kilning today, right, where the malt is dried with the application of heat, and that would happen in a so-called kiln, which is in its simplest form a grate on which the malt rests that is suspended over a fire, over a heat source, and that could be a fire, even with the smoke off the fire just going right through the grain, or it could be indirectly heated, where you would have ductwork that would carry hot gases from a furnace. It could be, for example, the steam engines furnace of the brewery, and those hot gases would be routed through ducts at the bottom of the kiln and would heat the air that then rises through the kiln and dries the grain. And there you would get kiln designs that also have multiple grates stacked on top of each other, where the grain would enter on the top grate and would then be, as it dries more and more, would then be moved onto lower grades, and then once it's off the lowest grade, it would be done. And one thing that you should, for example, look out for if you are in Germany and in some of these brewing centers, you should look out for these typical rotating hoods that used to be on these kilns. Now those hoods, they look like helmets, like a knight from a knight's armor. And their function was that they are only open to one side, and that a weather vane would always point this opening away from the wind, so the wind would not be able to blow the steam back into the kiln, or would be able to blow rain into the kiln. And you can see those, for example, if you go to the Wireman website and look at the old picture of their facilities, you see them on top of some of the houses, and those were the kilns.
Now, once you've got your malt produced and you've got it dried, storing it can have its challenges in that you can have mice and rats and rodents that like to eat the grain. So you get the cats in for pest control, but then the pest control can also have its problems, right?
Right. So the author mentioned that actually the mice and all this weren't really the problem with some of this. If it was the cats, and he talks about this habit of cats that can't be broken, that they would not leave their excrements on the floor, but they would actually bury it into the malt. And they would basically use the malt as their big litter box. And he also goes on to say, well, that actually solid excrements can easily be sifted out, while the liquid part is what sticks with the grain and may impede the beer a nasty property. And I thought it was pretty funny because he spent 2 paragraphs talking about that.
Well, you can imagine a giant barn-sized litter box, for the cats to go in. So nowadays I've heard people like the guys on craft beer radio talking about some IPAs having kind of a cat pee smell or taste from the hops. I guess back then it was more the malt that was the issue.
Yes. These are things that somehow you don't really find in real historic brewing texts. I mean, I don't claim that I'm a historian. I just translated one snapshot of what was written back then, and I don't really know how credible the author is, and I can't really put it in its place either with respect to other publications.
But it's interesting. It's a little slice of life, these little challenges that they had to deal with. So the milling of the grain was with a roller mill, similar to what we do today, right?
Yes, a roller mill was preferred if the brewers could use it. And some brewers, however, had to use the common mill of the town or village, especially in areas where the beer was taxed by the amount of malt that was used. So brewers weren't allowed actually to have their own mill. They had to go to a centralized mill and use that because that's how taxes were assessed.
So that if they are using a mill that's used to make flour, I guess that would be a bit of a challenge to make sure that was adjusted properly for. Right,
it was adjusted a little wider, and they also conditioned the grain with moisture. Something I talked about in the German brewing practices show, where if you can condition the malt with moisture, then you can keep the husks intact during milling, and they won't shred as much.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the brewing process itself, once you get to the mash tun, this is where we see decoction being common, right? In
yes.
German breweries.
Yes, he said that in the southern part of Germany, so Bavaria and around that time, that beers are decocted, whereas in the northern part of Germany and England, infusion mashes are much more common and not so much decoction.
And I guess we should define decoction as taking part of the mash away, boiling it, yes, and then returning it to the mash tun to raise the temperature of the mash.
Exactly, and in the infusion mash of that time was just, well, like homebrewers would do today, like a single infusion. You would just mix the malt with the water in the mash tun, let that sit, and then drain off the sweet wort.
So what was a typical decoction schedule like?
Well, a typical decoction schedule, for example, would take half of the brewing water or half of the strike water, mix that with the grain, and that while the rest is brought to a boil. A common brewhouse technology at the time was actually just two vessels. There was the mash and lauter tun, and there was a heated boil kettle that was used to heat and boil the decoction and also to boil the wort. And that mash and lauter tun would have a perforated bottom to also drain the sweet wort. Mm-hmm. Just like the equipment that most homebrewers have today. And more sophisticated breweries, especially towards the later part of the 1800s, they would have more vessels. They would have dedicated vessels for the mashing, for the decoction boiling, for the lautering, and then also for the wort boil. So you get then to the typical German 4-vessel brewhouse. But once half of that water was boiling, it was added to the mash, which raised the temperature to about 35 degrees, and the mash was mixed either by hand. Day laborers, for example, would do that, or some of the mash tuns had mechanical agitators that would assist the mixing of the mash. Once the mash was at 35 degrees Celsius and well mixed, then 1/3 of that mash was removed and boiled for 30 to 90 minutes. Now, the example that is given here in that book does not mention any rest. So I assume that they probably mixed for a long time, or it just that there were no long rests between the mash the decoction being returned to the mash tun and then the next decoction being pulled.
Now, you mentioned in your comments, which were very useful in the text, that these decoctions took a long time to come up to a boil.
Well, yes, that's what I assumed, that during that time there will be plenty of enzymatic activity that already converts the starch, that already converts the proteins, such that you don't really need these rests. So after the first decoction was boiled and returned, the mash temperature rose to about 45 to 50 degrees Celsius, and then another third is removed and boiled to get the mash to 60 to 65 degrees Celsius. And then a thin mash is drained and boiled. Now it's interesting here that for that mash schedule that is mentioned here, that there is no long rest at 60 to 65 Celsius, and that the thin mash is boiled as soon as that mash was well mixed. And the temperature, once that decoction is returned, the temperature is about 75 degrees Celsius, and what the author believed, or that brewer probably believed, was the best temperature for sugar production, and he would rest the mash for 2 hours now.
Now 75.
So that's a little different from what we generally read about what a traditional triple decoction mash is like.
Right. Yeah,
now, I do have to have
75 degrees Celsius is around...
It's a little hot.
Yeah, it's close to 170 Fahrenheit, so...
Yes, it's the upper end, and basically at that point you already did 3 decoctions, and one of them was a thin decoction. There is not much enzymatic activity actually left in that wort. And I assume that most of the conversion just happened during the process of heating the decoctions, or while the main mash is sitting and the decoction is heated. Mm-hmm. And the author also makes mention that some brewers believe that 65 degrees was a better temperature for sugar production. So I guess the other group was right at that point. Now we know.
65 is around 150 Fahrenheit, so that sounds more like
yes,
it.
Exactly.
So
once the mash is complete, the wort would be recirculated. So you would basically open the drain and you would shovel back the cloudy wort into the mash tun, and then you would drain all that wort into the boil kettle.
Now there's another interesting quote at about this time. It says about lautering, essentially, if possible, the spent grain should not contain any soluble compounds, but this is a godly wish which is far from being granted. So I can picture a lot of homebrewers saying that themselves today.
Yes. I don't really know what the mash efficiency was back then. The author is giving some numbers about weights and volumes, but I didn't really go through the exercise of calculating that. A lot of confusion arises to, well, when you see these old measures, is what type of measure was that? I mean, what is the conversion to between these measures? Because back then they didn't have the metric system. Mm-hmm. Actually, Germany was still divided. There was Bavaria, there was Prussia, and they had also different standards for measuring things. So it's difficult to really transfer measurements given in the text into today's measurements.
Now, into the beer kettle, how did boiling the wort differ in from what we do today?
It's about the same. They would put the hops into the wort and would just boil it. What's different for today is that they boil for a longer time, and they probably boiled stronger than today. The author also mentions some fairly exotic ways of boiling wort, because back then what they thought, at least I assume what the author thought, is that the preserving properties of the hops was actually coming from the oils rather than the bitter compounds. So he said that he's proposing some ideas how to preserve these oils in the wort from being driven off. Another interesting technique of boiling hops that I may want to try one day is that that all the hops are boiled in a small amount of wort first, and then the rest of the wort is added. The author says that would give the beer a peculiar and characteristic taste. So maybe there is something to that. That if you boil all the hops in a small amount of wort, and he actually calls that hop roasting. And maybe that's something worth trying.
Yeah, why not? Is there any indication of what the characteristics of the hops were back then? I mean, if we had some hops from that vintage from back then, would we recognize them as the same, types of hops that we use today?
I don't know really. I mean, I guess probably varieties that go back a long time, like Saaz or Hallertau. Those were probably similar. As he mentions for some of the beers, there was that the hopping rates were about a quarter to up to 14 pounds per 100 pounds of malt, and even up to 20 pounds for 100 pounds of malt for beers shipped to India. The text is not just talking about brewing in Germany; he also talks about brewing in England.
Ah, I see.
So I guess that is a reference to early IPAs.
Now they talk about using cool ships, which we're familiar with in talking about Belgian breweries even today.
Yes, well, cool ships existed for a long time in breweries and was the primary means of cooling wort.
And a cool ship is a shallow, sort of almost like a pan.
Shallow pan, yes.
Yeah.
It's a very wide, open, shallow pan where the wort stands in about 6 inches high. And the purpose of the cool ship is, well, for once, to cool the wort by just having this big open area, and then also to settle out the troop, the hot break, and the hops in the cool ship.
But there was also at this time sort of some new technology on the horizon.
Yes, and that was very interesting to see that. And what he talks about there is a modified cool ship where dividers are placed such that the wort would meander over the cool ship from one end to the other. So you would put the cool ship on an angle, and you would add the wort on one side, and it would slowly flow to the other side. And to improve the efficiency of that cool ship, he said that that piping was added underneath that flow of wort that goes in the opposite direction where cold water was added. So that would flow against the wort, and thus basically creating an ancestor of today's counterflow or plate chillers.
Right.
And so at some point they probably figured out, well, that it's better to just cover the whole thing, and that then they wouldn't get as much contamination, because the reason why cool ships are gone now from breweries are basically two things. They are huge, they take a lot of space, and the possibility of getting an infection is very high, because you basically rely on this, or you have this huge area of wort exposed to air, and that just calls for trouble. The author mentions that, for example, the cool ships were as finicky as that it was important to just open the vents just right, such that if they were opened incorrectly and the wind would blow into the cool ship, then it would spoil the beer.
And there was also, I believe it was in talking about the fermentation room, that you wanted it to be clean, and if there was a foul smell, then there was a better chance that your beer would be contaminated. Right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, yeah. I mean, these things had to be cleaned meticulously. He even talks about cool ships made from wood, but that they would be inferior to cool ships made from metal, because, well, wood would take up some would hold back some of the wort, and would seed infections in the wort.
So this again, if you're talking about if your fermentation chamber smells bad, then you might get infected, or you might get contaminated beer, or you might get beer that doesn't taste good. It's kind of like, well, you almost know what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
It smells bad because there is mold, or there is some sort of bad bug in there that's making the place smell.
Right. He's talking about a first fermentation and a second fermentation, saying that so the first fermentation is the good fermentation, and you don't want that second fermentation to start, which is the fermentation that produces vinegar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Probably just refers to means that just a fermentation that sours the beer, and that second fermentation could already start on the cool ship, thus spoiling the beer even before the first fermentation started.
Yeah, they almost got it.
Almost got it. Just had to cover up these things and had to find ways of cooling the wort without exposing it to air. But then, if they would have done that, they may have run into another problem. Because one thing they didn't do, they didn't aerate the wort. Mm-hmm. Now, back then they thought air is evil. You don't want to let air get to the wort if you can avoid it. So obviously, blowing air into a wort they knew was a bad idea. So they didn't do that. But they didn't really have that much problem with their fermentation, mainly because the cool ship, if the wort sits there, it is allowed to absorb air. Mm-hmm. from the environment. And then after the cool ship, what they would use is a cascade cooler. That is a corrugated sheet of metal where on one side there would be a thin stream of film of wort running down, and on the other side there would be piping where there is cold water pumped through, such that the hot wort comes down from the top and the cold water would come up from the bottom, that you have this counterflow effect again, and the wort would be cooled down all the way to about 7 to 8 degrees Celsius if it was for bottom fermentation. And for top fermentation, they only had to cool to about 20 degrees Celsius. But I believe it was this thin film of wort that was exposed to air which took care of the aeration and thus for providing oxygen for the yeast.
Now you mentioned top fermentation versus bottom fermentation. He talked about the difference in the dynamics of the fermentation process that would be brought about by a difference in temperature.
Yes. So what they figured out is that there's bottom and top fermenting yeast. So bottom fermenting yeast would just sit on the bottom and would not rise to the top, and top fermenting yeast would be at the top, like as we know it today. But what they thought is that actually it was a function of the temperature more than a function of the yeast strain. So far that they thought, well, you can change yeast to bottom fermenting by just fermenting it colder, and vice versa. Once you have bottom fermenting yeast, that if you successively ferment that yeast warm, that you would end up with top fermenting yeast. Now, my suspicion is that they didn't have pure strains back then. They just had a mix of yeast, and that depending on the temperature, it would favor one or the other. Or that the yeast if it ferments at low temperatures, that even top fermenting yeast at low temperatures, it would just not have that strong evolution of CO2 that actually would create these foamy croissants.
Now, they did have definite procedures on harvesting yeast after fermentation. Yes. So they did know that this was the important stuff.
Yes. So what they knew is that it was the middle part of the sediment that they wanted to use to pitch their new wort. So they said that the top isn't good, and that the bottom layer wasn't good either because it was dead cells and troop. So they would go for the middle part of that yeast, and they would then mix that with fresh wort and put that directly into the new wort, or they would let it sit until it starts on its own, like making a starter basically, and then add it to the new wort. And then it really depends on the particular brewer what method he believed in. So.
sort of a mixture of science and religion at that point.
Oh yeah, that's basically when I read these things, and the author always talking about how brewers are very opinionated about their process, and that's the only way you can do it, and that's the best way you can do it. Actually, it reminded me of some of the discussions we have on online forums today, where you get opinions one way or the other, and brewers can be very opinionated about what is better for your beer. So it hasn't changed much.
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yes.
So to close out the chapter or the your discussions, you talked about some of the beer styles that you found, some examples.
Yeah, so what they did back then they already analyzed beer. So they had hydrometers to measure specific gravities, or they measured the specific gravity, but they expressed it as percent sugar, which is more common in German brewing. And they also called attenuation and alcohol content. So a few of these books actually contain lists of beers at that time and what starting gravities they had and what finishing gravities. And one thing that is that while the starting gravities are similar to what we have today in German beers, the finishing gravities were much higher. So the beers were fairly under-attenuated by today's standards. So the apparent attenuation was generally around the upper 50s all the way maybe to the upper 60s.
Wow.
So if I look, for instance, pull out the Hofbräuhaus beer of the time, it would have an alcohol content of 3.8%, a original gravity of about 14 Plato. How much is that in specific gravity? Okay, it's 56.
Okay, there you
go.
So
it would have a starting gravity of about 1056, and an apparent attenuation of 62%. So that's not much.
Yeah, so some of these beers maybe were more nutritious than the beers today.
They were. I mean, one thing that the author talks about is that unlike a wine fermentation, a beer fermentation should not be done. Should not be completed at the brewery, because when the fermentation is completed, there would not be any more production of CO2, and it's the CO2 that gives the beer its liveliness. Now, we know today that you can actually finish a fermentation and still trap the CO2 if you just close the vessel.
Yeah.
So you thought that actually the beers were still fermenting. But also, if you have this decoction mashing scheme that we just talked about, where you actually where you don't really rest for a long time at 65 degrees Celsius, but a long time at 75 degrees Celsius, well, of course, you're producing a more dextrose wort. And malting at the time wasn't probably in such that there was a lot of amyloidic strength in these malts, such that actually they tended to produce less fermentable beers.
It doesn't necessarily follow that because our techniques are more modern and we're getting more efficiency from the from the mashing process and the malting process, and we're getting better attenuation from the fermentation process. It doesn't necessarily follow that our beers are quote unquote better today.
I don't know. I think they are better.
They're just different, right?
Well, yes, they are different, but I believe that there is a lot to just the technology, or how technology, for instance, makes the beers less prone to getting infections. I think a big problem back then was just getting infections. They were not as consistent. They didn't really have as good an understanding of how to sanitize things, or how to have pure yeast strains. That didn't happen until the later part of the 1800s. So I do feel that at least for my personal opinion, that modern beers are probably better than they were back then. But it would be interesting to taste the beer from back then. So.
Well, maybe you'll discover enough in your research that you can reconstruct an authentic German beer from the 1860s. That would be a fun thing to do. Well,
I actually had that thought when I was reading through that, and when I saw how detailed the description actually was, that actually one could just take that as the how to brew of the 1860s and really try to go from barley to glass by just based on these instructions that were given there. So I guess I would take the thermometer that I assume that it was invented back then. So I would assume that it was available, and I would use that to control the temperature during germination, and then I would try and kill the malt and do that decoction mash and use some homegrown hops to brew it with. It would be an interesting thing to do as well.
Well, this is a fascinating text, and I will put a link to your website, as usual, in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. And as usual, it's been fun talking to you, and always a fascinating conversation, Kai.
Well, thank you, and I would encourage others to just look around in the old books that are available there on Google Books. Maybe there are some books, some English books about brewing in England, and have English description of the brewing process at the time. It's a very interesting and enlightening read, I would say.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Kai.
Well, thanks.
Well, thanks again to Kai for his time and research. You should read the full text on Kai's blog to find more information. And maybe you can get some tips on how you can bring some more understanding of brewing techniques into the present time by reading what they were doing back then. And it's fun to see how far we've come as far as knowledge. You can find a link to Kai's blog in the description of this week's episode on basicbrewingradio.com. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. You can check out our homebrewing DVDs, Introduction to Extract Homebrewing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. And if you buy through our site, we've got combo deals to save you a few bucks. But you can also see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online from us at our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. I swear this is the continuing saga of the new shirts. I hope to have something to show you next week. And I also hope to go to press this week with the 2010 logbook. So those of you who have been emailing saying, hey, where'd the logbook go? Well, it's coming back. Brand new 2010 calendar in it. Thanks to everybody, as usual, who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Hunter 25517 Summer Breeze Ceiling Fan with white/bleached oak blades. White. And Jumbo Leaf Collection Bag. It's that time. Thanks again, everybody, at least up here in the Northern Hemisphere. Remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we appreciate your support. And don't forget that you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on our site as well. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dodson down in Austin, Texas. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.